The wagon wheel cracked clean through on the last stretch of red dirt road, and Rosa Yates did not cry, because she had not cried in 3 years and she was not about to start now, not when she was this close. She had come from San Antonio with 2 trunks, a mule named Chester who had opinions about everything, a small iron skillet she had inherited from her mother, and a piece of paper folded into eighths that she had read so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. The paper was a letter. It was not addressed to her. It had been addressed to a man named Samuel Yates, her father, who had died in the spring of 1878 in a boarding house in Laredo without ever having read it. Rosa had found it tucked inside his boot along with a stub of a candle and 4 coins that added up to nothing worth counting. She had read the letter, then read it again, and then she had decided that she was going to find the man who wrote it, because in that letter was everything her father had owed her and never paid. The year was 1882. The Texas Hill Country was bone dry in August, and the road to the Hunter Ranch was little more than a suggestion pressed into the pale earth by wagon wheels that had come before her. She had been following the directions a postmaster in Fredericksburg had drawn on a torn envelope. Turn at the 3 Oaks. Follow the creek bed south when you see the bluff. You cannot miss the Hunter place, the postmaster had said, because Lionel Hunter keeps the fence line so clean you can see it from a quarter-mile off. He had been right about the fence. She could see it now, neat cedar posts with wire stretched between them, running straight as a ruled line across the landscape. But she could not get to it because Chester had stopped and was refusing to move, and the right rear wheel of her rented wagon had split down the spoke so badly that the whole vehicle listed hard to one side like a ship taking on water. Rosa climbed down from the seat and walked around to look at the wheel. She pressed her hand against the cracked wood. She looked at the fence. She looked at Chester, who looked back at her with the specific expression of a mule who had been warning her about this road for the last 6 miles and felt entirely vindicated. "All right," she said aloud, to no one. "All right." She unhitched Chester from the wagon and tied his lead rope to the wagon frame so he could not wander, and then she did what any sensible woman in 1882 Texas would do when her wagon broke down a quarter-mile from a fence line. She put on her hat, smoothed her skirt, picked up the letter from the seat of the wagon where she had set it within easy reach that morning, and she walked. She was 26 years old. She had dark hair that was escaping its pins in the August heat, and brown eyes the color of good river mud, and hands that were not the soft hands of a woman who had lived gently. She had run a boarding house in San Antonio for 3 years after her father died, and before that she had cooked for a cattle outfit for a season, and before that she had done whatever needed doing in whatever town she and her father had landed in during the long drifting years of her childhood. She was not a fragile woman. She was a woman who had learned early that the world did not notice when you needed rest, so you did not wait to be noticed. The gate was a simple thing, a length of wire looped over a fence post, and she let herself through it and walked up the long lane toward the house. It was a good house. That was her first thought, said to herself as a fact and not a compliment. It was a low, wide ranch house built from limestone, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, and green shutters that someone had recently repainted, and a kitchen garden off to the right side that was serious and well tended. There were 3 horses in the near pasture, good-looking animals, and a barn that was freshly whitewashed, and a bunkhouse set back from the main house with a line of clothes drying in the hot air. The whole place had the quality of a thing that was cared for by someone who did not care for things out of obligation, but out of genuine attachment. She was still 50 feet from the porch when the front door opened, and a man came out. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with the kind of lean build that comes from work rather than inheritance. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw shadowed with 2 days of beard, and he was wearing a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and canvas trousers and boots that had seen considerable use. He was wiping his hands on a cloth, which told her he had been in the middle of something. He stopped when he saw her. Rosa walked the rest of the way to the porch and stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression she could not quite name yet, something between surprise and a careful kind of attention. "I am looking for Lionel Hunter," she said. "You found him," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, measured and quiet. He was still watching her with that careful attention, taking in the dust on her skirt, the hat, the piece of paper she was holding, and something in his face shifted when he saw the paper, though she could not have said what it shifted toward. "My name is Rosa Yates," she said. The cloth stopped moving in his hands. She watched his face. She had been watching for this moment for 3 years, had imagined it many times on the long road here, had wondered what she would feel when she finally said her name to the man who had written that letter. She had expected relief or anger or some clean emotion she could identify. What she had not expected was for his face to go absolutely still, the way water goes still just before something rises from underneath it. "Yates," he said. "Yes." He sat down on the top porch step, not gracefully, more like his legs simply decided the discussion was over without consulting the rest of him. He sat there for a moment looking at the ground between his boots, and then he looked up at her. "Samuel Yates was your father." "He was. He told me he had a daughter," Lionel said. "In the letter, I wrote to him that he had talked about you the times I had met him, and I mentioned you in the letter and I asked about you." He stopped. "I did not know he had died." "The letter never reached him," Rosa said. "He was already gone by the time it arrived in Laredo. I found it in his things." Lionel looked at the paper in her hand. "Is that it?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. A mockingbird was going through its repertoire somewhere in the big oak tree at the corner of the house, cycling through every song it knew, indifferent to the weight of the moment. "You walked up from the road," Lionel said. "Where is your wagon?" The wheel cracked. Chester would not move. "Chester. My mule. He is tied to the wagon frame. He is fine. He is very opinionated, but he is fine." Something moved across Lionel Hunter's face then, something that might have been the beginning of a smile, though it did not quite arrive. He stood up from the step. "Come up on the porch," he said. "It is too hot to stand in the sun." She came up the steps and he pulled a chair out for her, a plain wooden chair, and she sat in it and he sat in the other chair, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The hill country spread out below the porch in every direction, golden and enormous and dry, and the sky above it was the particular blue of late August that looks almost too bright to be real. "How long have you been carrying that letter?" he asked. 3 years, she said. He was quiet again. Then he said, "I carried the one I sent for 10 years before I thought to send it. I kept starting it and stopping. Samuel and I had a difference of opinion some years back, something foolish, and I kept thinking I would find the right words, and then one day I thought the right words do not exist for some things, you just have to say the true words instead." He looked at the paper in her hands. "I wish he had read it." "What was the difference of opinion about?" Rosa asked. Lionel looked at her steadily. "A horse. We both wanted the same horse back in '72. I bought it. He felt I had not played fairly." He was not entirely wrong. "He held grudges for a long time," Rosa said. I knew him well enough to know that. We worked together, him and me, on the same cattle drive, the summer of '69. He was a fair hand with cattle and a terrible card player, and he talked about his daughter every night around the campfire until the other men begged him to find another subject." Lionel paused. "He loved you very much, in his way." Rosa's chest tightened in a way she was not expecting, a sudden pressure behind her sternum. Her father's love had been a difficult country to live in, big and real, and completely without the ordinary conveniences of expressed affection. She had known it was there the way you know a river is under the ground in desert country, by the fact that things still manage to grow. "It was not easy," she said. "No," Lionel agreed. The mockingbird started a new sequence. The horses moved slowly in the pasture. Chester, a quarter-mile down the road, was no doubt eating whatever grass had survived the drought within reach of his lead rope. "What brought you here?" Lionel asked. "After 3 years." Rosa folded her hands in her lap over the letter. The letter says you two had agreed before your quarrel that if either of you ever got into a hard situation you could ask the other for help. And it says that you are sorry for the horse business, and that you would honor the original agreement even though you two had not spoken. And then it says something about the property your family owns and that you had no intention of marrying and that the place needed looking after. She paused. I ran out of money in March. I had been running a boarding house in San Antonio, but the owner of the building sold it and I had to leave, and I had $22 in my trunks in Chester, and I knew that letter by heart. She looked at him. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for work. I can cook. I can keep house. I can do whatever needs doing. I will work for fair wages and I will not be any trouble. Lionel was watching her with the same careful attention he had given her since the moment she said her name. The afternoon light was going gold and long across the porch. My housekeeper left in June, he said, got married to the new blacksmith in town and moved to Comfort. I have been managing on my own since then, which means things that should be done are not getting done. He looked out at the horizon for a moment. I have a spare room, clean, private. There is no question of charity. I need help and you need work, and you are Samuel Yates' daughter, which means I owe you what I owed him. Rosa looked at him. What do you owe me? A fair start, he said simply. She was quiet for a moment, considering him. He did not look away. There was something about him that she had not expected, some quality of directness that was different from the bluster she was used to in men, the way most men filled the air with words to make themselves seem larger. Lionel Hunter seemed to take up exactly the space he occupied, no more and no less. All right, she said. All right, he said. He stood up then. I will go get your wagon wheel looked at. We have a wheel wrench in the barn and some spare spokes. Might be able to patch it well enough to get the wagon back here and unload your trunks before dark. He looked at her. Can you find your way around a kitchen? There is bread dough that has been rising since morning and I have not had time to deal with it. I can find my way around a kitchen, Rosa said, in the tone of voice she used when a question was slightly underestimating the situation. He almost smiled again. She was beginning to think that was as close as he usually got, that almost smile that showed up at the corners of his eyes before it decided the mouth was not worth the trip. Good, he said. The kitchen is through the front door to the left. Everything is where it looks like it should be. He paused. Thank you, Miss Yates. Rosa, she said. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. Lionel, he said, and walked down the porch steps toward the barn. She watched him go, this stranger she had been traveling toward for 3 years, and something settled in her chest that she could not name, some easing of a tension she had been carrying for so long she had stopped knowing it was there. She went inside and found the kitchen, and it was exactly where he had said it would be, and everything was exactly where it looked like it should be, and the bread dough was enormous and ready, and she punched it down with the heels of her hands and shaped it into loaves and slid them into the cast iron stove, and then stood in that good clean kitchen in the golden afternoon light and breathed, truly breathed, for the first time in a long time. Lionel came back with Chester and the wagon, having fixed the wheel with 2 new spokes, and the iron banding he kept in the barn for just such emergencies. He had the mules settled in the corral with fresh water and hay before Rosa came out to help unload the trunks, and they carried them together without ceremony, one at each end, through the front room and down the hall to the spare bedroom, which was clean and cool, and had a window that looked out over the kitchen garden. They ate supper that evening in something that was not quite comfortable silence, and not quite uncomfortable silence either. A kind of thoughtful quiet that sat between them at the table like a third party. They were both being polite, too. The bread was good, and there was a pot of beans with dried chili that Lionel had started that morning, and coffee that was strong enough to make a case for itself. The bread is very good, Lionel said. It was already mostly bread when I got here, Rosa said. You mixed it. I mixed it, yes, at around 4 in the morning when I could not sleep. She looked at him across the table. Do you sleep poorly? Sometimes. He looked at his coffee cup. Less than I used to. She did not press him on it. She was not a woman who pressed when someone indicated a door was closed. They talked a little about the ranch, about the cattle he ran, a modest herd of longhorns, about the two ranch hands who worked for him, brothers named Pete and Cal Dawson who bunked in the bunkhouse, and who she would meet in the morning. They talked about the drought and whether the creek would hold through September and what it was like in San Antonio now, which Lionel had not visited in some years. After supper she washed the dishes and he dried them, which she had not expected, and when she glanced at him sideways about it he said, with complete straightforwardness, "I have been washing my own dishes for 2 months. The habit did not leave just because someone else is here." It was such a practical answer that she liked him better for it. She slept that night in a real bed with a good mattress and clean cotton sheets, and a window open to the night air, which smelled of cedar and dry grass and the faint distant suggestion of rain that never quite came, and she slept all the way through until the birds started, which had not happened in a very long time. The next morning she was up before Lionel, which she had intended, and she had coffee made and biscuits in the oven and bacon going in the skillet when she heard him come through the house. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped when he smelled the coffee. He looked at the table and then at her, and then he said, "You did not have to do that." "I know I did not have to," Rosa said. "I wanted to. Also I was awake and idle hands and so forth." He poured himself coffee and sat at the table and they were quiet again, but it was different now from the night before, less careful, less like two people deciding what to say to each other and more like two people simply being in the same space without needing to fill it. Pete and Cal Dawson turned out to be in their mid-20s, sunburned and cheerful, with the specific energy of young men who work hard and sleep well, and find most things in life moderately amusing. They were respectful and not in the least complicated about Rosa's arrival, accepting her with the equanimity of men who had been feeding themselves indifferently for 2 months and were grateful for improvement. Pete, the older one by 2 years, was the kind of person who made friends with everyone and everything. He had already made friends with Chester, which was no small achievement. The days fell into a pattern. Rosa cooked and kept the house and tended the kitchen garden, which had gone a little ragged in the summer heat, and responded with gratifying enthusiasm to regular watering and some attention. Lionel and the Dawson brothers worked cattle in the mornings and fenced and fixed in the afternoons, and in the evenings they all ate together on the porch when the air was cooler, and then the brothers went to the bunkhouse, and Rosa and Lionel sat for a while in the evening quiet before the dark got full. It was in those evening sessions on the porch that Rosa began to know him. Not the facts of him, the facts she had gathered quickly enough, but the texture of him, the particular way his mind worked, the things he cared about. He had grown up in this country, on this land, which his father had settled in the 1850s when Texas Hill country was as raw and uncertain as any frontier. His mother had died when he was 12, his father when he was 23, and he had run the ranch alone since then with one hired hand, and then two. He had been briefly engaged once to a woman in Careville, but it had ended quietly and without drama, and he did not seem to carry bitterness about it. Only a certain resigned understanding of how two people could want different things. He read when he could, had a shelf of books in the front room that Rosa noted with interest. Among them, a battered copy of David Copperfield, and a collection of surveying manuals and a Spanish Bible, and a worn almanac from 1879. He was methodical and patient about most things but could be short-tempered when he felt something was being done unnecessarily badly, and he apologized when he was short-tempered, not with excessive drama, but with the simple acknowledgement that he had been unfair. He listened when people talked, which Rosa had not understood as a rare quality until she was old enough to compare him to most of the men she had known. She told him about her life over those evenings, not all at once but in pieces, the way you tell things to someone when you are beginning to trust them, testing each piece before you offer the next one. Her childhood moving from town to town with her father, who had been a drifting man, full of plans that were perpetually one good break away from paying off. The years of cooking and keeping and doing, the boarding house in San Antonio, the regulars who became something like family in their impermanence. The way she had taught herself to read from whatever was available, newspapers and labels and the occasional discarded book, because her schooling had been interrupted so many times it had never properly taken root, and she had decided she would fill in the gaps herself. "What did your father tell you about me?" Lionel asked one evening. It was late September and the evenings were beginning to cool, and there were stars overhead in extravagant quantities. "Almost nothing," Rosa said. "He mentioned you once. He said you were the best horseman he had ever seen and the worst poker player and the most irritating man in any room because you were always right about practical matters." She paused. "He said it the way he said things about people he respected. He never talked well about anyone he did not respect." Lionel was quiet for a moment. "He taught me something on that cattle drive," he said. "I was 19, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about working cattle. He was patient with me in a way I did not deserve. I remembered that when I was short with young Pete last year about the fencing. He looked at his hands. I wrote the letter because I was thinking about that patience. I thought he ought to know I had not forgotten it." Rosa looked at him in the starlight. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the dark horizon, where the hills were a darker shape against the dark sky. "He would have been glad to know you wrote it," she said. "Even if he could not say so. He was not a man who said things like that." "Neither am I generally," Lionel said. "I know," she said. "I noticed." He looked at her then, and there was something in the look that was different from the careful attention of the first days, something that had been building quietly through the weeks since she arrived, like water rising in a well. "Do you miss San Antonio?" he asked. "No," she said, and was surprised to find it was true. "I was never attached to places. My father saw to that." She looked out at the hill country, the immense dark silence of it, the occasional bark of a coyote in the distance, the cedar smell of the night air. "But I think I could become attached to this place." He did not say anything to that. But he did not look away either, and the silence between them had a different quality now, a warmth in it that had not been there at the beginning. October arrived, and with it the first real relief from the drought. 2 days of rain that came sweeping in from the north on a cold front and filled the creek back up and turned the grass a shade greener and made the limestone hills glow with a particular amber color in the rain light. Rosa stood on the porch and watched it come and felt something she could only call happiness, a clean, simple thing, uncomplicated. Lionel came and stood beside her to watch the rain. They were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her shoulder, and neither of them moved to increase the distance. "The creek will run good into winter now," he said. "Good," she said. They stood there watching the rain together, and it was one of the simplest things that had ever happened to Rosa Yates, and one of the best. The trouble came in late October, as trouble often does, wearing an ordinary face at first. His name was Virgil Cord, and he rode up to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon when Lionel was out checking the east pasture fence with Pete and Cal. Rosa was alone at the house, which was not unusual. Cord was a big man, well dressed by local standards, with a hat that was too fine for the dust it was collecting, and a way of sitting his horse that said he was comfortable with being looked up at. He wanted to buy the ranch. He was not the first man who had wanted to buy it. Lionel had mentioned, in passing, that a land buyer from San Antonio had been making offers on properties throughout the hill country, assembling acreage for reasons that had to do with speculation and the railroad rumors that were always circulating. He had declined twice already. Rosa told Cord that Mr. Hunter was not at home and that she would pass along his visit. Cord tipped his hat with the excessive politeness of a man who does not particularly respect the person he is being polite to, and said that he hoped Mr. Hunter would reconsider, because the offer would not remain available indefinitely. He rode away down the lane, and Rosa watched him go with a feeling in her chest that was not quite dislike and not quite suspicion, but lived in the neighborhood of both. She told Lionel that evening. He listened with the attentiveness he gave everything, and then he said, "Virgil Cord. Yes. He has been buying up land along the creek all summer, something to do with water rights and the railroad surveyors. A man in Careville told me Cord made offers on 6 properties in 3 months and 2 of the ranchers took them." He paused. "I do not intend to sell." "What if he comes back with more money?" Rosa asked. Lionel looked at her. "It is not about money," he said quietly. "My father is buried on this land, my mother. This is not something you sell." Rosa nodded. She understood about things you do not sell, even when the world thinks you should. Cord came back 2 weeks later, this time when Lionel was home. Rosa was in the kitchen and could hear the conversation on the porch, not every word but the shape of it, the even measured cadence of Lionel's voice and the louder, more insistent tone of Cord's. It went on for 20 minutes and then she heard Cord's horse leave at a pace that expressed strong feelings. Lionel came inside. He was very calm, which she had learned was not the same as being unaffected. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden. "He offered twice what the land is worth," Lionel said. "What did you say?" "I said the land is not for sale." "He suggested I might want to think about it more carefully, which I understood to mean he thought I would change my mind." Lionel set down the coffee cup. "I will not change my mind." "I know," Rosa said. He looked at her then, and she could see that the certainty of her answer had meant something to him, had eased something. "He said something else," Lionel said. "He asked about my housekeeper. He had heard there was a woman at the ranch." He looked at her steadily. "He implied, in the way that men like that imply things, that a woman living at a man's ranch without certain arrangements being in order was the kind of situation that caused talk." The air in the kitchen changed. Rosa kept her voice level. "And what did you say?" "I said my housekeeper's situation was entirely proper and none of his business." He paused. "But I thought about it, Rosa. After he left, I thought about it." He was quiet for a moment, and the quiet was a different kind than usual, heavier with something he was working toward. "I did not bring it up before because I did not want you to think I was using the situation as an excuse to say something I was not entitled to say. But the truth is that people in town have started to form impressions, and while I care nothing about Cord's opinion, I care about yours." Rosa looked at him across the kitchen. The afternoon light came through the window and lay golden on the floor between them. "What are you trying to say, Lionel?" she asked. He met her eyes. "I am trying to say that I would like, very much, to have the right to tell Virgil Cord and anyone else who asks that you are not my housekeeper." He stopped. "That is, if you have any interest in changing the arrangement, which I understand entirely if you do not. You came here for work and fair treatment, and I would not want you to think I am making your situation uncomfortable by—" "Lionel," she said. He stopped. "I have been sitting on that porch with you every evening for 2 months," she said, "and thinking about how you will look at me when you think I am not watching, and listening to everything you say and the things you do not say. And I have been trying to talk myself into being reasonable and practical about the whole situation because you had not said anything and I was not sure." She paused. "So yes, I have an interest in changing the arrangement." The something that had been building in Lionel Hunter's expression for weeks arrived then, fully, all at once. It transformed his face in a way that was startling and entirely wonderful. "I am glad to hear it," he said, and the simplicity of it was more eloquent than anything more elaborate would have been. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and stood in front of her, close enough that she had to look up at him, and he took her hands in both of his, and they were warm and rough and certain. "I want to do this properly," he said, "and I understand if you need more time. We have only known each other 2 months." 2 months and everything you carried in that letter for 10 years, and everything my father told me about you without knowing he was telling me," Rosa said. "I feel like I have known you longer than that." He raised her hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, gently and deliberately, and Rosa felt it down to her heels. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Because I want to ask you properly, and not because of Cord or what anyone in town thinks, but because I have been wanting to ask since the first week you were here, and I have been trying to be sensible about the proper amount of time." She looked at him. The mockingbird was at it again outside the kitchen window, going through every song it knew. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He was not a demonstrative man by habit, but he put his arms around her then and held her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the kitchen in the afternoon light while the mockingbird sang, and the coffee went cold on the counter. And it was the first time in a very long time that Rosa Yates was in a place that felt like it was hers. They were married in Fredericksburg on a Saturday in December, at the small German Lutheran church, whose pastor had known Lionel since he was a boy, and who performed the ceremony with a warmth that made it feel like a celebration rather than a transaction. Pete and Cal Dawson were there, scrubbed clean and wearing their best, looking genuinely pleased in the uncomplicated way of young men who like to see good things happen. The postmaster who had given Rosa directions was there with his wife, a few neighboring ranchers and their families, a woman named Hilda Braun, who had been Lionel's nearest neighbor for 20 years and who embraced Rosa afterward with a fierce enthusiasm that said she had been hoping for exactly this for a long time. Rosa wore her best dress, which was deep green and fit her well, and she had a winter rose from Hilda's garden tucked into her dark hair. And when she walked up the aisle of that small stone church and saw Lionel Hunter standing at the front of it in his good suit, looking at her with the full attention he gave to things that mattered, she had the brief and powerful sensation that the entire long and difficult road of her life, all the moving and the losing and the doing without, had been aimed at this exact moment without her having known it. He took her hand when she reached him and held it through the whole ceremony, and when the pastor said he could kiss his bride, Lionel kissed her gently and completely, and she felt that too, all the way down. The winter was mild and good that year. The creek stayed full, and the cattle stayed fat, and the kitchen garden produced through December with a stubbornness that Rosa found personally satisfying. She and Lionel fell into a life together that felt both new and strangely already familiar, as though they had been practicing for it without knowing. She learned the particular geography of him, the way he woke early and stood at the kitchen window with his first coffee in both hands looking at whatever the morning had brought, the way he was careful with words but lavish with action, fixing things, improving things, attending to things without being asked. He was the kind of man who showed love through maintenance, through keeping the fences tight and the water trough full and the wood box stacked, and once Rosa understood the language she found it completely eloquent. He learned her in turn, her directness and her sense of humor, which was dry and quiet, and tended to emerge when least expected, her absolute competence in most practical matters, her love of the evening sky in all its varieties, and the fact that she read voraciously and would not be spoken to until she finished a chapter, which he respected with great care. He bought her books. He brought them home from Fredericksburg, wrapped in brown paper, and left them on the kitchen table, and each time he did it was so quietly and without ceremony that she nearly wept, because she had never in her life been given something by someone who had simply noticed what she loved and acted on that noticing without waiting to be thanked. Virgil Cord came back in January. He came with a lawyer this time, a thin man from San Antonio who had papers in a case, and he had a new argument. He had, he said, discovered a question about the original title on the southwest parcel of the Hunter land, a question about whether the survey from 1856 had been properly filed. He was very sorry to bring it up but felt, as a neighbor, he had an obligation to inform them of the issue. Rosa watched Lionel's face while Cord talked. The stillness that came over him was not the stillness of a man who was being defeated. It was the stillness of a man deciding which direction to hit. After Cord and his lawyer left, Lionel sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood. Rosa poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. "Is there a real question about the title?" she asked. "I do not know," he said honestly. "My father filed everything himself. He was a careful man, but I cannot say for certain whether every detail was handled correctly in 56. The records would be in Austin." "Then we go to the land office in Austin," Rosa said. He looked at her. "It is a long trip." "I know what a long trip is," she said. "I came from San Antonio on a cracked wheel." He almost smiled, and this time it made it all the way to completion, a full proper smile that rearranged his face completely and made him look younger and more open than his usual expression. Rosa found it absolutely devastating. They went to Austin in February. It was a week's journey there and back, and they stayed at a decent boarding house on Congress Avenue and ate at a German restaurant where the food reminded Rosa of Fredericksburg, and the coffee was strong enough to stand up and argue. They spent 2 full days at the General Land Office, going through the records with a clerk who was young but thorough. And at the end of the second day, the clerk spread the survey plat on the table and pointed to the filing date and the filing number and said, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who enjoys being definitive, that the Hunter survey of 1856 was properly registered in every particular, and there was no legitimate question about the title. Rosa and Lionel sat in the lobby of the land office afterward with certified copies of the relevant documents, and Lionel looked at them for a long time. "Cord knew," Lionel said. "Yes," Rosa said. "He knew there was no question. He was hoping we would not check or that we would not want the trouble and expense of checking." "He will not bother us again," Lionel said, and though his voice was quiet it was also extremely certain. He was right. When they returned to the ranch, and Lionel sent a letter to Cord's lawyer with the certified document numbers, and a note that said simply that the matter of the title was entirely resolved, and that Mr. Hunter's land was not for sale at any price, and that any further attempts to create legal uncertainty about the property would be addressed accordingly, they heard nothing more from Virgil Cord. He moved on, Rosa learned later from Hilda Braun, to less thorough landowners further west. Austin had also given them something else, something quieter and more personal. They had been married 2 months by the time of the trip, and still finding the balance of things, still in that tentative early period when you are learning to be 2 people who are now 1 household. The days of travel, the close quarters of the boarding house, the shared task of the land office research, all of it had accelerated something. By the time they turned the wagon toward home, there was an ease between them that had not been there before, a settled certainty. Riding back through the hill country in the clear February air, with the cedar trees dark green against the pale limestone hills, and the first hint of wildflowers beginning in the roadside ditches, Lionel reached over without looking at her and took her hand from her lap and held it on the wagon seat between them. And she looked at his profile, at the strong line of his jaw and the way he was watching the road ahead with the particular focused quiet that was so entirely him. And she thought, I chose right. Not just that she had chosen right in coming here, in following the thread of a 10-year-old letter to a ranch she had never seen, but that something in her had always been trying to get here, to this man, to this hand holding hers on a wagon seat in February in the Texas hill country, and all the difficult years before had simply been the journey. Spring came with wildflowers in enormous extravagance, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush carpeting the roadsides, and the meadows in colors that seemed almost theatrical, too bright and too abundant to be taken seriously. The creek ran clear and cold. The cattle grew fat on the new grass. Pete Dawson was courting a girl in town, a minister's daughter with red hair and strong opinions, and he reported on the progress of this courtship at supper with such detailed and earnest commentary that even the reserved Cal was moved to occasional advice. Rosa's mornings began to have a different quality sometime around March. A heaviness, a nausea that announced itself with precision every morning around 6 o'clock, and then departed by mid-morning, leaving her entirely normal and in fact somewhat hungrier than usual. She sat with this information for a week before she said anything, partly from caution and partly because she wanted to be sure, and partly because she was still, in the deep interior of herself, a woman who had learned to hold good things gently before she let herself believe they were real. She told Lionel on a Tuesday evening in late March. They were sitting on the porch after supper, the night air warm and carrying the smell of the bluebonnets in the front meadow, and she had been planning what to say all day, and then abandoned all of it when he looked at her and said, "You have been wanting to tell me something for a week." "I have," she said. "I have noticed," he said with the almost smile. She turned to face him in her chair. "We are going to have a child," she said. "In October, I think." He was still, that particular river-running deep stillness. And then he leaned forward and put both hands on her face, cupping it gently, and he looked at her with an expression that was so open and unguarded that she felt she was seeing a part of him he did not show easily, some interior room he kept private and had just let her into. "Rosa," he said, and there was a whole long quiet paragraph in the way he said it. "I know," she said. He kissed her forehead, slowly and deliberately, and then her cheek, and then her mouth, and she put her hand over his and they stayed like that in the warm spring evening with the bluebonnets in the meadow and the stars coming up overhead. And it was, Rosa thought, exactly as much as anyone could be given in a single moment. The pregnancy was steady and uneventful, which Rosa took as a mark of good character on the part of the baby, who was clearly already a practical and sensible individual. She worked through the summer heat the way she worked through everything, efficiently and without excessive drama, though Lionel developed a habit of appearing at her side whenever she was attempting anything strenuous with an expression of barely contained concern that she found both touching and occasionally maddening. "I am not made of glass," she told him, in July, when he appeared next to her while she was hauling water to the garden and gently took the bucket. "I know you are not," he said, walking to the garden with the bucket. "You are clearly made of iron, but the baby might be made of something more breakable, we don't know yet." She laughed, which surprised her, and he looked pleased with himself in a way he rarely allowed himself. They talked about names in the evenings. It was one of their regular subjects through the summer, going through possibilities with the kind of comfortable seriousness that had come to characterize their best conversations. They ruled out a great many names for various reasons. They agreed on some principles, something solid, something clear, something that would wear well over a lifetime. "If it is a boy," Rosa said one evening, "I would like to use Samuel for my father." Lionel was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I think that is right." "And if it is a girl," Rosa said, "I was thinking about Lionel, it was my mother's name." "Lionel Hunter," Lionel said, trying it out. "Yes." Rosa looked at him. "You never talk about your mother." "I lost her young," he said, 12. "It is hard to talk about things you lost before you knew what you had." He paused. "Her name was Clara. She was from Virginia originally. She had a laugh that you could hear from the barn." "Clara," Rosa repeated. "You could have both," he said. "Lionel Clara if it is a girl." She looked at him for a long moment. "Lionel Clara Hunter," she said. "Yes, that is a very good name." The baby came in early October, a week before Rosa had calculated, arriving on a cold, clear morning that smelled of cedar and autumn. Hilda Braun came to help, having delivered a considerable number of babies in her years in the hill country, and she was calm and competent and cheerful throughout, which was exactly what was required. The labor was long and difficult in the way that first labors often are, and Rosa handled it with the same quality she brought to everything, gritted teeth and determination, and the occasional sharp word that Hilda weathered without concern. Lionel spent the morning in the front room and the afternoon on the porch, and by evening he had walked every square foot of the ranch yard at least twice. Pete and Cal stayed discreetly near the barn, finding small tasks to occupy themselves. The baby was born in the early evening, just as the sun was going down and the sky was turning all the October colors, gold and pink and deep blue, and it was a boy. Lionel came into the room when Hilda called him, moving carefully as though the floor might give way, and he stood at the bedside and looked at the small red face in Rosa's arms, and his own face did something complicated and quiet, and she watched it happen and loved him more than she had yet, which she had not thought was possible. "Samuel," she said, watching Lionel's face. He sat on the edge of the bed and touched the baby's head with one finger, very gently, with the same care he gave to new calves and broken things. "Hello, Samuel," he said, in a low voice meant just for the baby. "You gave your mother a considerable day." Rosa laughed, exhausted and entirely happy. Samuel Hunter yawned enormously, unimpressed by the occasion of his own arrival, and went to sleep. The first years of Samuel's life were full in the way that life with a small child is full, loud and busy, and occasionally chaotic and frequently wonderful. He was a child who had opinions from the beginning, who looked at the world with a steady, curious attention that reminded Rosa powerfully of his father. He walked early and talked constantly, and had a relationship with Chester the mule that was one of the great devotions of his first years, visiting the corral every morning with a piece of carrot or apple he had obtained by asking whoever was nearest, because he was already smart enough to know that asking one person after another was more reliable than asking one person twice. Lionel was a quiet and thorough father, present in the way that mattered, close without being hovering. He took Samuel with him on the gentler ranch tasks from the time the boy could walk steadily, carrying him on the saddle in front of him to check the cattle, teaching him the names of things with patient repetition. Rosa watched them sometimes from the porch, father and son, the small one pointing at everything and the tall one answering every question, and she thought about the letter that had brought her here, the 10 years it had waited in a boot, and the 3 years she had carried it before she finally followed it, and she thought that all that time had not been wasted. It had all been leading here, to this porch, this view, this life. Pete Dawson married his minister's daughter in the spring following Samuel's birth, and Rosa and Lionel attended the wedding in town with Samuel, who was 6 months old and slept through the ceremony, and then woke during the reception, and entertained everyone present by being cheerful and interested in everything. Pete's wife, whose name was Margaret, was exactly as opinionated as Pete had reported and considerably funnier than he had mentioned, and she and Rosa became friends with the straightforward directness of women who recognize each other. Cal Dawson stayed on the ranch a few more years, and then moved west to start his own small spread near Junction, which everyone had expected because Cal had always been looking at the horizon with the particular expression of a man who has somewhere else to be. He left on good terms, with a fair wage saved and Lionel's recommendation, and 2 of the horses from the ranch that Lionel gave him because he said Cal had earned them, which was true. A new hand came, a young man of 19 named Thomas, who was the son of a Mexican ranching family from further south, quiet and hardworking and extremely skilled with horses in a way that even Lionel, who was himself very skilled with horses, acknowledged with respect. Thomas stayed, and the ranch continued. Rosa and Lionel had 2 more years of just Samuel before another child arrived, a winter baby born in January of 1886, and this one was a girl. They named her Eleanor Clara Hunter as they had planned, and she arrived with a completeness to her, settled and observant, dark-haired like Rosa, with Lionel's gray eyes and his quality of taking everything in before deciding what to do with it. By the time Eleanor was born, Rosa and Lionel had been married 4 years. They had found the full depth of each other by then, had been through disagreements and resolutions, through the hard autumn of 1884 when the cattle prices dropped, and they had to make careful decisions about the herd, through the death of old Chester the mule, which hit Rosa harder than she had expected, and which Lionel handled with a gentle seriousness that she was grateful for. They had been through the long nights of infant care and the particular exhaustion of the early years of raising children, and through good seasons and difficult ones, and through all of it the thing between them had not diminished but deepened, had become more rather than less, had put down roots that Rosa felt as something solid under her, no matter what the weather was doing above. There were evenings still on the porch, even with children in the house, even with the particular beautiful chaos of a household with a small boy and a baby. After the children were asleep, Lionel and Rosa sat in the evening air and talked or were quiet, and it was still the best part of the day, the part that belonged to just the two of them. "Do you remember the first evening you sat here?" Lionel asked one night in the autumn of 1886. Eleanor was 9 months old and Samuel was not yet 4, and they were both improbably asleep at the same time, which felt like a gift. "I remember everything about that day," Rosa said. "The wheel cracking, Chester's expression, you coming out of the door with that cloth in your hands." "You were holding the letter," he said. "I was holding the letter," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I have thought many times about what would have happened if I had sent it 5 years earlier, or if he had read it and come himself, or any of the other ways the story could have gone." He paused. "But I think it had to happen the way it did. I think we had to both be ready." Rosa looked at him. "Were you ready?" "I was ready the moment I saw you at the bottom of the porch steps," he said. "I just did not know it was readiness at the time. I thought it was surprise." She laughed softly so as not to wake the children. The stars were very bright that night, enormous and close in the clear fall air. The mockingbird, or possibly one of its descendants, was doing its late evening performance in the oak tree. "I knew," Rosa said, "when you sat down on the porch step like your legs had made the decision for you. I thought that is an honest man, and I was so tired of men who were not honest." "Your father was honest," Lionel said, "in his way, blunt and difficult and not always kind about it, but honest." "He was," Rosa said. "It was the thing about him I could always count on. He never told me a comfortable lie. He told me things were hard when they were hard, and that we were poor when we were poor, and when he was wrong about something he said he was wrong without much ceremony." She paused. "I think that is what made you familiar to me. You reminded me of the best thing about him." Lionel reached over and took her hand, the same gesture on the wagon seat all those years ago, and she wove her fingers through his, and they sat there in the good night air, in the home they had made, and the weight of all the years before, all the difficulty and the drifting and the loss, had not disappeared but had become part of the foundation, part of what made this solid. The ranch grew steadily through the late 1880s. Lionel bought the adjacent parcel when the Hank family decided to move to San Antonio, good limestone upland pasture that connected cleanly with the existing land. And he and Thomas worked the expanded herd with the addition of one more hand, a steady older man named Bill Garrett, who had worked cattle his whole life, and who communicated almost entirely in short sentences and small nods, and who was, Rosa discovered, a surprisingly excellent checker player. She expanded the kitchen garden, and then expanded it again. And then she started selling the surplus at the Fredericksburg market, which became a regular Saturday activity that she eventually turned into a more formal enterprise. Hilda Braun's daughter helped her box things up, and Margaret Dawson, Pete's wife, came with her sometimes, and the three women had established among themselves a friendship that was easy and honest, and the kind that does not require constant maintenance but simply continues. Rosa taught herself better reading by going through Lionel's shelf systematically and demanding another trip to Austin in 1885, which they made, and she came home with a box of books that included a medical text and 2 novels and a history of the Texas Republic, and a collection of Spanish proverbs that she studied with the same methodical attention she gave to everything. She taught Samuel his letters at the kitchen table, using the same mix of things that had taught her, newspapers and almanac pages, and eventually a proper primer she ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio. Samuel was a child who ran everywhere and talked constantly, and had a natural sympathy for animals that expressed itself in the periodic rescue of various creatures that did not strictly need rescuing. Eleanor, by contrast, was a child who moved with precision and observed with great seriousness, and communicated her opinions with a clarity that made adults laugh and sometimes retreat. She was 4 years old when she informed Bill Garrett that he was sitting in the wrong chair and that the light was better for reading from the other one, and she was so entirely serious about it that he moved without comment. "She is her father's daughter," Rosa said to Lionel, watching this. "She is her mother's daughter," he said, in the tone of a man who finds the whole situation deeply satisfying. The letter had lived in Rosa's trunk for all these years, through the move to the ranch and the marriage and the children and everything else. She took it out sometimes and looked at it, the soft creases of it, the handwriting that she now recognized as Lionel's, the dated header that said 1872 because that was when he had started it, even though he had not sent it until 1878. It still said the same things it had always said: the apology about the horse, the memory of the cattle drive, the mention of Samuel's daughter, the offer of help that had been meant for Samuel and had found Rosa instead. She told the children about the letter when they were old enough. Samuel, at 8, was satisfyingly impressed by the journey it had taken, the years of waiting, the boot, the road from San Antonio. Eleanor, at 5, listened with the complete seriousness she gave to all information, and then asked how a letter could fit inside a boot, which was a practical question that Rosa answered with a demonstration using an envelope in her own boot, which was slightly too small but conveyed the point. "But why did grandfather keep it in his boot?" Eleanor asked. "Because he was keeping it safe," Rosa said. "He kept the things he valued most close to him." Eleanor thought about this for a moment. "Then he valued it," she concluded. "Yes," Rosa said, "he did." "Even though he never read it," Eleanor said. "Some things you value without quite knowing why," Rosa said. "Your grandfather was like that sometimes." Eleanor considered this with the expression she wore when filing new information into whatever elaborate internal system she maintained. Then she nodded once, decisively, in the manner of a person who has reached a satisfactory conclusion, and went back to whatever she had been doing. The autumn of 1888 was the best autumn Rosa could remember on the ranch, and she had now experienced 6 of them. The rains had been steady all summer, the grass was thick and green into October, and the cattle were in excellent condition. The air had that particular quality of a Texas hill country fall, dry and sharp and clear, smelling of cedar and the beginning of winter. And the sky was the deep blue that looked like it went all the way to the edge of everything. Samuel was 6 and Eleanor was 2.5 and Rosa was 32 and Lionel was 37, and life had the quality of a thing fully inhabited, not comfortably settled, because the work of a ranch and a family and a marriage was always ongoing, always requiring attention, but solidly, genuinely inhabited. They were sitting on the porch on an October evening, the children asleep, the ranch quiet around them, the stars out in their full abundance. Lionel had his arm around her and she was leaning against him, her head against his shoulder, which was one of her preferred positions in the world. "I have been thinking about the letter," Lionel said. "Which one?" "The original one, the one that came to your father and did not reach him." He paused. "I want to write something for the children, something that tells them where they come from, the whole story of it, so they have it." Rosa lifted her head to look at him. "A letter. Something like that. A letter or a record. Something that says where this place began and the people who were here and how you and I came to be here together." He looked at her. "I do not want the story to be lost the way things get lost." "You are thinking about your parents," she said. "I am thinking about yours too," he said. "Samuel Yates should be remembered somewhere. He was a complicated man, but he was part of all of this. Without him we would not be here." Rosa was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark hills and the enormous sky. "Write it," she said. "I will add to it. My mother's name, my father's history, what I know of it. We will put it with the land records in the strong box. The children should read it when they are old enough to understand it," Lionel said. "Eleanor will understand it before Samuel does," Rosa said. "She is already working on everything." He laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, the laugh she had been hearing for years and had never tired of. He pulled her back against him and pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I am glad you cracked that wheel," he said. She felt the smile in her chest before it reached her face. "Chester cracked the wheel," she said. "He was being difficult." "Chester saved us considerable time," Lionel said. "If you had rolled up to the gate properly, I might have been more guarded about the whole thing. But a woman who walks up a ranch lane carrying a 10-year-old letter and asks for what she needs directly is not a woman you can be guarded with." Rosa turned her face up to look at him. The starlight was in his eyes, that particular gray she knew as well as she knew her own hands now. "You were not very guarded," she said. "You sat down on the porch step." "My legs had information my brain had not processed yet," he said. She kissed him then, reaching up with her hand on his jaw, and he kissed her back fully and thoroughly. And the October air moved around them, and the stars were outlandish in their brightness, and somewhere in the near pasture one of the horses made a soft sound, and the ranch was quiet and good in theirs. They wrote the letter together over several evenings that winter, Lionel's careful handwriting and Rosa's additions in her rounder, harder-won script, going back through what they knew and what they remembered and what they wanted their children to understand. They wrote about the cattle drive of 1869 and the horse that had caused the quarrel of 1872 and the letter that had waited 10 years to be sent and 3 more to be followed. They wrote about Samuel Yates, who had talked about his daughter every night around the campfire and had been a fair hand with cattle and a terrible card player, and had died in Laredo in 1878 with his boots on and his most important piece of mail unread. They wrote about Rosa's mother, Elena, who had died young and whose name lived now in a small dark-haired girl with gray eyes who was already the most organized person on the property. They wrote about the ranch, what it had looked like when Lionel's father built the first stone walls, what the creek had done in the drought and the flood years, where the old survey markers were, and what they meant. They wrote about the land, because the land was part of the family's story, as much as any of the people were. And they wrote about each other, in the careful private way of people who know that what they are writing is a love letter disguised as a record, that the practical facts of the ranch and the legal description of the property are holding inside them something much less practical and much harder to describe, which is the fact of 2 people who were aimed at each other by time and chance and the survival of a single envelope, and who found each other across the distance and recognized immediately, in the way that people sometimes do, the particular shape of the thing they had been looking for. Rosa wrote the last line of it, because it had been her idea to end it with something for the children specifically rather than just the record of facts. She sat at the kitchen table on a February night in 1889, with the lamp throwing golden light on the page and Lionel across the table with his coffee, watching her write, and she wrote, "You come from people who were not easy, who did not have easy lives, who did not have things handed to them, and who did not expect them to be. You come from a woman who cracked a wagon wheel and walked the rest of the way, and a man who kept a letter for 10 years before he found the right true words, and from a grandfather who loved fiercely and imperfectly, and whose boots were better at keeping letters than he was at posting them. You come from this land and this creek and this porch and these stars. We hope you will find your way to whatever it is you are aimed at, and that you will be honest about what you want and patient with the distance between wanting and having, and that you will know when you arrive." She put down the pen and looked at what she had written and then looked up at Lionel. He had been reading as she wrote. "Yes," he said quietly. She folded the pages and put them in the strong box with the land records and the certified documents from the Austin Land Office and the original letter, which she had kept all this time, which had started everything. The letter that had waited 10 years to be sent and 3 years to be followed, folded soft as cloth at its creases, carrying the handwriting of a young man and the words he had finally found. She closed the strong box and sat back down at the kitchen table, and Lionel poured them both more coffee, and they sat together in the warm lamp light in the house that was theirs, in the life that was theirs, while the February wind moved through the cedar trees outside, and the children slept in their rooms, and the creek ran full in the dark beyond the pasture. And everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved. And the story that had begun with a letter in a boot and ended here, at this table in this light, with these hands holding this coffee and this man across from her with his steady gray eyes and his quiet smile, was complete. Spring came again, as it always did, with the bluebonnets carpeting the meadow in that theatrical, extravagant blue and the paintbrush bright as fire between them, and Chester's successor in the corral, a mule named Henry who had inherited Chester's opinions wholesale, and Samuel running through the meadow shouting the names of things he knew, which were many, and Alina walking beside her mother on the porch steps, her small hand in Rosa's, looking at the wildflowers with the focused attention of a person cataloging important information. Lionel came up from the barn and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at his family, at Rosa and Alina on the steps and Samuel in the wildflowers, and his face had the expression it sometimes had in moments like this, open and private at the same time, a man who had not expected this much and was aware of it. Rosa looked at him from the porch. The morning light was full and golden. The hill country stretched out in every direction, enormous and green after the winter rains, and the sky above it was cloudless and deep and went all the way to the edge of everything. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. The almost smile arrived and made it all the way. "I am thinking," he said, "that it was a very good thing that wheel cracked." She smiled at him, full and unhurried, the smile of a woman who is entirely where she belongs. "It was Henry's predecessor's finest hour," she said. He came up the steps and stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she always did, and Alina made a sound of mild protest at being briefly squeezed between them, and then accepted the situation with the pragmatism that defined her. And Samuel came running up from the meadow with a fistful of bluebonnets, and shoved them at Rosa with the exuberant generosity of a 6-year-old who has just discovered that flowers make people happy. And she took them and held them, and the color of them was almost too bright to look at, that deep particular blue, and the morning was everything, and the porch held them all, and the ranch spread out around them, kept and cared for, the fences clean and the creek full, and the land as solid under their feet as the love that had brought them here, patient and stubborn and enduring as limestone, as water finding its way home. The letter lived in the strong box, which lived on the shelf in the front room, between the battered copy of David Copperfield and the almanac from 1879. Samuel found it when he was 12 and read it 3 times, and came to his mother in the kitchen with the particular look of a child who has discovered that the adults in his life had once been something other than his parents. Rosa sat with him at the kitchen table and told him all of it, the way she had never had it told to her, the full and careful account of where he came from and why, and Samuel listened the way he had begun to listen to important things, with his father's steady gray-eyed attention wearing itself gradually into his young face. Alina read it 2 years later at 10 and returned it to the box without a word, and then came to find her mother that evening and said, "I think great-grandfather was right to keep the letter in his boot." Rosa looked at her. "Because you never know," Alina said, "which thing will be the important one." Rosa nodded slowly. "That is right," she said. "You never know." The children grew. The ranch grew. The years passed in the good, ordinary way of years in a life that is working, full of seasons and small emergencies and celebrations, and the steady daily accumulation of a home being lived in. Lionel's hair went gray at the temples and then gradually throughout, which Rosa found entirely distinguished and told him so, and he told her that she had not changed at all, which was not precisely true but was true in the ways that mattered. Which is that the woman he had seen walking up the lane with a 10-year-old letter was still entirely visible in the woman who sat across from him at supper, and slept beside him, and tended the kitchen garden, and laughed in the evenings at something one of the children had said. They had a third child born in 1891, another boy, whom they named James, after no one in particular because they felt they had honored the family names adequately, and this one deserved something new. James was the sunniest-tempered person in the household by a wide margin, easy and curious and comfortable in his own skin from the beginning, and everyone adored him without making a project of it. The strong box was passed to Samuel when he married, at 24, a capable young woman named Dora who was the daughter of a sheep rancher from the next county, and who had the practical good sense that the Hunter land seemed to require. Rosa gave it to him on their wedding day, and inside it with the letter and the land records and the pages she and Lionel had written was the original envelope the letter had come in, with the postmark from 1878 and Samuel Yates Sr.'s name in Lionel's young handwriting, and Rosa's father's address in Laredo that had never received it. "The whole story is in there," Rosa told her son. "All of it. Read it with Dora." He nodded. He had his father's eyes and his grandfather's directness, and something that was entirely his own. Something easy and forward-looking that Rosa recognized as the quality of a person who had grown up in a home that held. She watched him ride away with his bride and the strong box on the wagon seat between them, and she stood at the gate in the good autumn air, and Lionel came and stood beside her the way he always came and stood beside her when she was watching something that required watching. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He put his hand in hers. The hill country was gold and amber in the October afternoon, and the creek was running clear in the distance, and the fence line was clean and straight the way it had always been, and the porch held the chairs they had sat in for 20 years, worn now and comfortable, that knew the shape of them. Rosa turned from the gate and looked at her husband, this man she had walked toward on a cracked wheel and a folded letter, and a hope she had barely admitted to herself. He was 50 now, and more entirely himself than ever, more of everything she had seen in him on that first afternoon, the steadiness and the honesty and the quiet that held things rather than avoiding them. "I have been thinking," she said, "that I would like to plant another rose along the south fence. There is room and the soil is good there." He looked at the south fence, considering. "We could do that," he said. "We can go into town Saturday and see what Hilda's daughter has at the nursery." "Good," Rosa said. They walked back toward the house together. The mockingbird in the oak tree was running through its whole repertoire, every song it knew, one after another, filling the afternoon with borrowed music. In the house, the lamp would come on at dusk. Eleanor would write a letter to her brother in her precise, thorough hand. James would come in from the pasture with Thomas, who had been there for nearly a decade now, and was as much a part of the place as the limestone walls. Supper would be on the table, and the good ordinary evening would unfold in the good ordinary way that was the substance of the life Rosa Yates had come here to find, and Lionel Hunter had kept the fences straight for, all those years, waiting without knowing he was waiting, for the woman who would arrive with a cracked wheel, and a name he knew from a letter he had been carrying in his heart for 10 years before he finally found the courage to send it. They went inside. The door closed behind them. The hill country held them in its immense and beautiful quiet, the cedar smell of the evening, the stars coming up one by one in the darkening sky, and the lamp light warm in every window of the house that was theirs.